and I'll just refer to this so I get it accurate. We found that high exposure and these were odds ratios, so always and they were adjusted. I think for gender, we adjusted them for trauma exposure, because that's a pretty obvious confounder, and length of service. When I say we, AUT did. So high exposure to potentially traumatic events versus low exposure. Those with high exposure were almost 2 times more likely to report one or more of those mental ill health conditions. Where it got really interesting, so about 2 times the likelihood if you've got that high exposure. When it got really interesting, though, was high perceived organizational support versus low perceived organizational support. 2.8, so almost 3 times more likely if you feel well supported and like your leaders in organization are prioritizing your well-being and actually value what you do. You're 3 times less likely to report those pretty significant mental ill health outcomes. So even more so than high exposure to potentially traumatic events. And then the other one that came through. Yeah, sure.
Pausing there for a second, Josh, because I know in first responders organizations, there's this real big focus on exposure to trauma, right? And you're saying, like you said earlier, this is something you cannot change. But organizational support is something that the organization can change, right? Like they can choose whether they're supportive or whether they're a dick.
Yeah. I mean, that's our hope, right? That there's things that we can do that can shift the dial when it comes to people's perception of how the organization is treating them and valuing them. And there's
and that was even
we can do
more,
about the facts.
Yeah, I'm sorry, sorry to interrupt, but that's even more important, or even more strongly related to people's mental health or lack of, compared to trauma exposure as well, right? The thing that is actually within the control of the organization.
And I'm glad I can talk a lot, so it is good to just stop and let that sink in. Is that people's perception of how their leaders and organizations supported them and the degree of trust there contributed to a higher likelihood of reporting mental ill health than high exposure versus low exposure to these potentially traumatic events or critical incidents. So, that's good news and bad news. Like, not great that was high. Unfortunately, in the survey, only 6% of the firefighters felt highly agreed that the organization cared about them. Right, so that's the bad news. The good news in some ways is it's highly associated with mental ill health outcomes. So if we can do things where the firefighters genuinely believe that their organization, their leaders care about them, we can potentially, reduce the risk for these, really terrible mental health outcomes.